today is ecosystems and biomes.
To that. So when we start looking at this concept of ecology, ecology is the basic science of environmental science, and it's primarily focused on the way organisms interact with each other. Now, some ecologists do look at the abiotic or non-living surroundings too. So depending on what their specialty is, they can study how organisms interact with each other or how the environment or abiotic factors interact with the organisms themselves. And when we discuss environment, and it's funny because in environmental science, I think this is the first time we're really defining it in detail. So the environment means anything literally that affects an organism during its lifetime. And that includes any factor out there, that we could measure, including time and even things going on in outer space that affect the Earth. So we can divide the environment into two things. One are what are called the abiotic factors, and this literally means non-living, not dead, but non-living. This usually means, things like energy, rocks, water, temperature, other things that affect matter, and usually includes things like non-living matter or processes. Biotic factors includes anything that is alive and even dead. And believe it or not, dead things interact in the environment too, and we'll see that a little later with the role of what are called decomposers in the environment. So when we look at trying to break down our understanding of nature, this whole idea of an ecosystem, ecosystems are very complex, and they build up into these large groups of or categories of environment called biomes, which we'll cover a little later. So when environmental scientists, and particularly ecologists, study ecosystems, we break it down into the basic elements. Okay, I mean molecular elements, but components. So we have the biotic components, okay, which includes organisms and their interactions with each other. And this is shown in the chart just of, for example, a very sick-looking robin, and that robin may use a tree for shelter, okay, or it may eat caterpillars or some type of insect that uses the tree as food. And when the robin dies, its body becomes food for things like mushrooms, which are decomposers, and the decomposers also make access to dying trees and even remains of a worm that are not eating or eaten, or the poop of the robin after it ate a worm. And then decomposers themselves eventually contribute nutrients to trees and to even maybe insects that the robin eats. So this is all complexity of how things interact with each other. And then we have the abiotic conditions, and this includes a list of things, which is just a partial list. That means energy in the universe, climate or overall conditions of the atmosphere, of the earth, weather or very specific occurrences. Climate tends to deal more with averages, weather with a specific event, sort of like a hurricane, a sunny day, whatever. Then we have the minerals, which means materials made of elements that come from the ionic or metallic compounds that make up a bulk of the earth. And then there's water, atmosphere, or air. We talked about pH a little earlier, which is a condition of the molecular chemistry of water. We have salinity, which we'll deal with a little later, that has to do with the amount of salt present in a body of water. And then, of course, there's temperature, and temperature can be related to weather. It can be related to other factors too. There's the soil component of the abiotic factors, of course, sunlight, and then, of course, various atoms and molecules that make up a lot of these abiotic materials. Now, when we start looking at the environment in general, we're going to see that creatures have sometimes very general, sometimes very specific environmental requirements. And these are called limiting factors. That means once a creature encounters a limiting factor, that could affect its survival, it can die, or it affects its reproduction potential, which, is responsible for, of course, carrying out the next generation and could significantly impact the population of that creature, and in some cases even causing its overgrowth or elimination. from the environment. So when we talk about limiting factors, just like the definition shows here, it's any factor, any variable that means abiotic or biotic, okay, that if there's a shortage of it, or a scarcity of it, it could reduce the health or the reproductive success of that population. And for example, scarcity of water in plants or scarcity of nutrients to plants can affect their growth and value and health and even their reproductive success. Climate in general can affect the availability of specific food to an animal or affect its own survival too in that environment. So when we start looking at limiting factors, it just means resources that keep an organism alive. And when we and all organisms have what's called a particular range of tolerance. That means what type of environment can I survive in? What's the lowermost range, the uppermost range of, let's say, the amount of water I take in, the spread of temperature range I can live in, the humidity I can live in. These are all significant, and this is very important. We start looking at the effects of climate change and what are called biome changes, because biomes also have their own range of tolerance in which an environment itself, an ecosystem itself, could survive in, and so do humans. Humans have, for example, a temperature range of our basic survival without protection, without shelter, of probably about 5 degrees Fahrenheit to about 120 Fahrenheit, in which after that point many of us will be uncomfortable to the point of dying, and the last thing on your mind might be reproduction. We go beyond that range of tolerance and we affect, of course, a larger part of the population. And then there's two terms we need to be familiar with too when discussing where organisms fit into the environment. There's this concept called habitat. And think of habitat as just the environment itself, where a creature lives. What does that environment provide it as far as abiotic and biotic factors? And here's a pretty little scene. This looks very much like what's called the Delaware Water Gap in the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border, where I used to do environmental studies as an undergraduate. And it's a very wet, beautiful foresty area, considering it's surrounded by urban areas. There's a fair amount of rainfall, a fair amount of streams, a fair amount of moisture, and you get all these beautiful ferns and mosses growing. It almost looks like a tropical forest, except it's cool. But if the rainfall increases too much, it could significantly affect the growth of mosses due to flooding. Mosses don't deal with flooding. It could also kill off a lot of trees, and too little rain could lower the humidity area and also kill off mosses and ferns. So this habitat has its own range of tolerance. But each organism has its own unique habitat that it lives in. And its habitat range could be broad or it could be narrow. So some creatures can live in a variety of habitats, where some are stuck in one type of narrow habitat. And then there's the term called the niche. Not Nietzsche, that's an existential philosopher, but niche. Niche means the role or the occupation, profession. What does that organism do in its niche? Now, this is very important because in our society today, sometimes we remove an organism from a niche, and you'll see a video about this a little later called organismic unintentional migration or transport, in which an organism is transported by storms, particularly, to another region, and it ends up in another habitat where potentially it can survive. And if it does survives, it takes on a different niche. Okay, so niche is very important because each creature has its own unique role. And when you have two creatures with similar niches in a similar habitat, they have to learn how to get along and cooperate, or they compete in a way that one dies off, the other survives. So these two terms are very important. Creatures can share habitats. That's okay. But it's very difficult, we're going to see, for a creature to share the same niche. And this even happened in human history, when our own ancestors, Cro-Magnon, eventually becoming Homo sapien, ran into Neanderthals and other types of people. We ended up with very similar niches and competed with each other to the point where one group remained. So some examples of niches and what an organism plays. Beavers, there's little Bucky there, okay, build their habitat. They find an area that they find comfortable for themselves as far as vegetation and the types of trees they need and flowing water, so they can build a dam in which they make their own temporary pond, because they literally live underwater inside these little dams. It's like a little condo with an underwater entrance. It's incredible protection because beavers are nice and fat and juicy, and they taste good to a lot of wildlife. So what they do is build the habitat they need, and that's actually part of their niche. They're pond builders. We've had some on campus that keep damming off our gully and causing minor flooding, and we have to remove them. Sometimes we did it wrong by dynamiting the dam, not realizing that the beavers are living in there, and we sent them on an intergalactic trip or smashed them into a building at excessive speed. So now what we do is we locate them to a nature trail, which when they do build ponds, it has no impact on the direct campus environment. Now, when we look at dandelions have a very broad range of places where they could live, but they like disturbed areas. And what their niche basically is, they populate disturbed areas and literally help with soil formation and help to establish an area so that later on the soil is broken down and literally full of nutrients for trees to use. They're very temporary creatures. Beavers tend to be a little more permanent. Okay, dandelions have a range of temperature that is, funny enough, the higher limits are Houston's. You don't see as many as I saw growing up in a kid in New York and in Canada. Okay, in Canada we see a lot of them. They're cold weather plants, and they're actually invasives introduced from England. Now, when we start looking at individual creatures and how do they fit into their environment, we measure creatures. How do you identify a creature? I just said, here's a beaver, here's a dandelion. But that's what we call a general or colloquial term. In science, we have to be very specific on how we classify things. And humans tend, that's our general nature anyway, is how to classify. But our classification schemes can sometimes be very weak. I mean, we run into this even with what we think are simple things like gender. We have trouble sometimes identifying gender into two categories. The same is true when we look at things like human race. And this is also true when we look at animals. When you see that we can classify animals in many ways. And one way is classifying them into what we call species. And this is a very broad classification. It just means a population of organisms that tend to reproduce with each other and look similar. Now, this is kind of crazy. Because, guys, when I was in Toronto, we run into the problems of moose mating with cows. Now, they didn't have successful offspring, but they were sure attracted to each other to the point where they were okay with it. And you know, we find this in humans too, that humans could associate with other creatures and do some, you know, similar activities. We find that oak trees, what we used to think were species, interbreed with other ones that are completely unrelated and look different. And the same is true for zebras and horses. They could mate and have successful offspring that are now inhabiting Africa, where horses were introduced as wild horses accidentally into the zebra populations. So when we look at this thing called a species, it's our best way of identifying an individual type of creature. Now, what we find with species is species can be globally distributed, or they can be locally distributed, and they can live in what's called a center called a population. So right here, here's a population of different tigers. Okay, and we have a population here, okay, of tigers too. So these hash marks identify one species of tiger versus another. And notice these lumps are populations. That means this species of tiger only interacts in that area. And look at that little gap there. That means that they don't cross that. There's some barrier, either a mountain range or a highway or something that separates that population from this. So an important concept is a population of a species. It means that that group tends to stay with each other and interbreed. And guys, when you interbreed for long periods of time, you carry a certain genetics to you that we call basically inbreeding genetics. or familial genetics. It gives them a very uniqueness depending on the genes of that population and the local adaptations that occur in that population, meaning natural selection. Okay, so this population can look different than this. This is very typical in tigers and giraffes. There might be similar species, but have different stripes and whatever. Now here we see another species of tiger is living in the same range of population as another species. And as long as they're sharing different niches, they can get along. Or what they do is they carry out their niche in non-overlapping areas. That means that this is kind of like the turf for that tiger, and that's the turf for that tiger, and the two don't get along. And in some cases with tigers, they may either interbreed or not along these little borderline areas. So when we identify a creature by species, that's very important to understand its population. And guys, sometimes what happens is that populations become very unique to the point where these almost look like or behave like different species, depending on certain habits and genes that they carry. So, what makes creatures the way they are? Very important in environmental science is this term called natural selection. And guys, natural selection is not a goal-oriented thing. That means animals don't intentionally do this. It is not what we call teleological. That means it has no predetermined end. It's arbitrary. And what it is the result of the interaction between creatures between each other and creatures between the abiotic environment. And it's not a type of adaptation. What it is, it's either a creature survives or it reproduces successfully. That means lots of kids in generations. Natural selection is not something that occurs within a current population. It's something that gets passed onto the next generation of population. So what natural selection basically means is that the environment, I'll give it the big E there, okay, or biotic interactions, that means interactions with other creatures, can either select traits within a population that are favorable or unfavorable. So if you have a population of tigers, let's say that some are born with stripes, some without. What we've learned is that the stripes on a tiger can give it recognition that it's a tiger of a particular species. And this is done a lot with zebras and creatures like that. So let's say you are not recognized because of a certain gene you inherited or through mutation you got, is that you're not going to be able to mate. And what's going to happen for your chance to have offspring? It might disappear, except you might have offspring of those that look like you, and now you have a separate population of ones that have no stripes. Now in zebras, if you're born without stripes, and that happens, you're born all black, which is, believe it or not, the default, or all white, which happens, it's not that you can't mate, because they primarily mate by smell. They identify each other. You can't get what's called herd protection. That means when a predator sees a herd of zebras, the stripes make it difficult to identify individuals, and it's hard for a lion or a tiger or a hyena or something to attack an individual. It gets frightened by this whole big blob and mass. That's why you hang out with your buddies when you're a zebra. Now, if you have no stripes, that means you're all black or all white, you stand out like a friggin' McDonald's burger screaming out, "Eat me." And that tiger goes right for you, and you try to blend in, not knowing you don't blend in, and you're a goner. And everybody else is going, "Whoa, I'm glad he was here," because you become the meal. So, and that means your traits do not carry on, and obviously you don't either. So what happens with species is when species live in different populations, they can actually, through natural selection, acquire separate traits depending on where they live. And guys, we see this even in birds with their bird songs. Robins that live in the north actually have a different accent than robins that live in the south, and they use their singing accent as a way of attracting mates. Now think about this. I've moved around the country. I've even lived in other countries, and my accent sometimes became an impediment for getting along with people. They would have preconceived notions about me, and it could even affected my mating. If people said, I don't like your accent, I don't want to mate with you, whatever. I mean, that's very likely in the animal world. So natural selection also works at the level of ecosystems. That means if environments change, if factors change, or the organisms within an ecosystem change, an ecosystem could also lose its components, or certain components become over-exaggerated. For example, when you urbanize an area, it loses a lot of its wildlife and gains a different type of urban creatures that become now the urban wildlife. And it totally changes the nature of what's going on, the whole dynamics of that environment. Natural selection is obviously attributed to Darwin, and it's probably not the most flattering picture of him. From what I understand, there's not many flattering pictures of him. This is when he was younger. Okay, most of us are used to the gray beard type of pictures of Darwin towards the end of his career. But basically, what I'd like you to know about Darwin is he came up with 3 important statements that allowed him to understand how creatures affect the environment. Because, guys, he was not an evolutionist, because there wasn't evolution back then. He was a natural scientist trying to understand why do creatures fit into the environment, how do they adapt. So just please read these through, because his observation was that when creatures have babies, okay, the babies in a population tend to show diversity. Guys, all humans don't look alike. There's probably some natural selection reason for that, and sometimes there's not. It just means genetic changes occur. You're going to have children and have traits that don't look like you. That's very simple. That's a very simple process, and it's very typical. It's very common. Now, guys, most of the time our children do look like us because that's just the norm of genetics. But variety is important. Some creatures don't change a lot, like cockroaches look the same for probably about 100, 200, 300 million years. Very little variation, but they don't need a lot of variation to survive. Other creatures do. Okay, so guys, he also learned that organisms within a species typically produce more offspring than are needed to replace them. So guys, for example, lobsters can live up to 60 years. The oldest was like 115. You live in an aquarium in a restaurant of all places, and he was never eaten because they felt sorry for him. Okay, he was so old. But lobsters can live 60 years, and in their 60 years they can produce thousands and thousands of children. A lobster couple only needs 2 to survive, to replace themselves in nature, which means over those years that lobster lost in a stable population. That means where the numbers are not changing, it produced thousands of offspring that died. And this is very typical of organisms. Some organisms produce millions of offspring a year. And think about cockroaches being that way. And you only need 2 to survive to the next generation. This excess, Darwin believed, interacted with this and found that what happens is that individuals in a population die off when there's too many. And the die-off is usually due to particular characteristics at the time that either favor a creature to reproduce and produce lots of babies, or takes away from that creature, and they die. Okay, they're not favored. So just understand what these principles mean. Natural selection, okay, primarily explains how populations get selected for or against to survive to the next generation. And that's very important when we start talking about environmental change, because it's not that creatures are adapting. That's something called homeostasis. They do that within a range of tolerance. Humans have a range of tolerance, and once we go beyond 120 degrees, your circulatory system just fails, you overheat, you die from a heart failure. Horrible. Okay, but we have people that are probably adapted for 150, and they do okay. But they only do okay, let's say, in a warm environment. They might not do okay otherwise without the benefit of a hot environment. Okay, so the conclusions we make about Darwin from his observation is, again, this whole idea of the likelihood of surviving. And what's important is reproducing. You can survive to be 200 years old. But when you die, your traits are not going to be carried into the next generation unless you reproduce. And we sometimes call this genetic sexiness or sexual selection. So not only do you have to survive, you have to reproduce. So what does natural selection look like over time? Is, let's say you have here a grackle, a blackbird, you see commonly around here, and it tends to eat beetles. And let's say it prefers green beetles that live on a tree bark because they can see them, and the tree bark is brown. Now, in that beetle population, just through normal mutation, just like we have people with different skin color, you have beetles that could have different colors themselves. And some could be the color, like that color, brown or beige. Some could be green. I apologize for my color blindness. Okay, is that if they're living on a bark in which their color looks like the bark, it's hard for the grackles to see. So they pick the greens and the orange and the brown, kind of like over time, remain behind. Now, of course, the greens are producing more greens, but they kept eating. If the grackles get a little crazy over time, they might eventually eat all the greens until there's no greens left, and it's only the ones that they can't see. Now, that could be a problem for them because they lost a food source, but also this is very unlikely to occur because usually green ones will be born all the time. Okay, so this can happen in the population, and this is very typical. And what's funny is once something like this does occur, the grackles might find something else to eat or leave the browns alone, and there's no selection, and guess who comes back? Because in many cases, guys, this mutation here, which protects them on the bark, might shorten their lifespan or have another feature to that. Guys, we have learned that humans have an environmental genetics just like other animals. And if you have the genetics for type 2 diabetes, we found out that genetics, just like in other animals, protects you from starvation. Isn't that incredible? You will actually survive starvation better than other creatures, and so will your children. I should say better than other humans. But the problem is, in a lifespan that we live today, into our 80s and soon into our hundreds regularly, diabetes can make you sick to the point of affecting your reproductive potential. This is kind of frightening when we look at it. So there's no such thing as a good or a bad trait, or as a stronger or a weaker trait. It all depends on the environment. So what are some outcomes of natural selection, or what we call evolutionary patterns? Is we have this thing called speciation. That means over time, two separate populations, or what we call subpopulations in an area, depending on environmental conditions or food, can actually genetically vary so much that they actually become a different species. That means they look so different we categorize them separately. And guys, in human history, we have done this. We have identified ourselves based on skin color and facial appearance as different species. And our human ancestors, like Neanderthals, were close enough to mate with us, and we were an overlapping species, but because of appearance and other factors, we ignored them as being human and annihilated them very likely, and even maybe ate them. We don't know. In some cases, we bred with them, but that's all part of the overlap of speciation. Now, other creatures, their genetics in the world of natural selection can kill them off totally. And this is particularly true with anthropogenic or human change, is we can wipe out a creature, okay, totally. In some cases, we can wipe out all the populations. And we start talking about environmental policy. Environmental scientists really don't like losing populations to extinction. We really don't like what we call mass extinction. That means that whole group is gone. And many politicians, when they look at extinction, they are going to be only concerned about mass extinction. They don't care about population extinction because they don't understand, too, that populations can actually be unique and have some somewhat speciation present in them. Another outcome of evolutionary patterns, particularly when you have creatures being naturally selected by other creatures, is the whole idea of called coevolution. That means any organisms interacting with another organism, they develop genes or select. They're selected for genes that perfect that interaction. That means In 1 year as an undergraduate, I had the chance of studying this orchid called Brassavola nodosa, a really kind of ugly little white orchid that lived in very limited regions of Central America. And we would go out and collect that orchid because it was actually becoming endangered due to deforestation and war going on in the area that was literally killing off a lot of the trees. Okay, due to defoliants that the military used. So we were studying that orchid to better understand how to conserve it later on, and even how to bring it back to greenhouses and take care of it. That orchid was only pollinated by one moth that came out at night and did its job. That's kind of frightening, but we did find, because it's limited, but and that moth literally only pollinated or fed on the nectar of that orchid. They became so codependent on each other that they had no other way of surviving. And this coevolution could be a problem. I mean, it's great for the moth and the orchid because they keep themselves alive. But if one dies off, they're gone. Both of them are gone. So we were very interested in that. But something funny, too, we discovered a mutation in that orchid that actually, instead of blooming at night, it bloomed during the day, and that gave it the option of finding other pollinators that could keep it alive. And this might have been one strategy to protect the orchid too. So we collected them to see if it was a genetic mutation that did that, or was it something we can train into the plants and actually conserve them that way. So these are just called natural selection outcomes or patterns, things that we see occur in an environment. So here's an example of speciation. These are all beetles that have a very common ancestor. That means they had the same literal ancestors and all looked alike, and it's hard to tell who looked like what and what the ancestors look like. So this is speciation. So at one time, this came from a common ancestor of creatures living in different and sometimes remote populations. And they all, because of the environment and interactions with other organisms, their genetics was selected to make them look different ways and even have different feeding habits. Like some of these are nasty predators. Other beetles are leaf grazers. And then there's extinction. Ask any dinosaur that. Oops, you can't. And ask any ancient mammal. Oops, you can't. Because they are totally gone. And that means something about their habitat, their interactions, their range of tolerance has been surpassed, and they all disappeared. All populations. Sometimes we do find out that things are not extinct when we find small populations existed in areas where we never thought we'd see the creature. And this has happened to a Southeast Asian rhinoceros. Recently one was discovered in Vietnam, and we thought they were all extinct. And it was found in one little remote forest, only a few of them. So of course they're the focus of a lot of conservation efforts. So again, here's coevolution I discussed, particularly interactions between birds or pollinators, moths, butterflies, bees, and flowers. The bill of the hummingbird is very adapted to this particular plant, where the food that the hummingbird likes, the sugar, is all the way down there, and they can stick their beak down there. So again, these relationships occur over thousands of years of time, where each creature, its genes are selected for them to coexist. Now there's other kinds of organismic interactions. So we can look at the interaction, okay, of different species of creatures, okay, or similar creatures within a population. Okay, so we have this thing called conspecific interactions. Conspecific means, it's also called intraspecific. And that means how do creatures, that means like a male or female in that population, interact with each other. Or how do related ones, like different types of deer, okay, that are closely related, interact with each other. Okay, and then we have what's called interspecific. So this is, I don't know what species that is, but these are two different species of deer. That looks like a red deer. So if you put them together, how do they interact? Do they compete with each other? Do they coexist? These obviously have to coexist because they're the same species. So conspecific just means how do creatures in a species interact? Because this is very important too, because they're all in the same niche and they're sharing the same resources, and they have to be able to mate and get along. Then we have another interspecific interaction called predator-prey. This is not just getting along and maybe competing for resources. This is I am your food, and I am the one that eats you. So this is a totally different interaction, but all of these have natural selection factors to them. That means all of these interactions promote genetic diversity or stability over time within a population. So the most common probably interaction we're going to talk about in this class is what we call the inter, that means between, not within, the interspecific interaction of predation, where a predator benefits from food, and the predator could be anything that eats any type of food. Usually what we're talking about is animals, but you could predate on plants too. Prey means who's being eaten, and that's because I better pray I'm not. Actually, it's different spelling. So we have predator prey here between antelope, okay, and a cheetah, and we have a little true chameleon here and a nice tasty little morsel on his tongue. Predator prey. So this is one type of environmental interaction that we find that contributes to how ecosystems work. Another type of interaction, and this could be inter or intra or conspecific, is competition. And here's where you're really now seeing the terms intraspecific and interspecific. So guys, within a population, that means two species living together, you obviously have to compete for with the members of the same species. And that means you either have to cooperate or you have to make sure you grab the food before someone else does and keep your family alive. Usually what we see is some organisms, they're selfish to the family. This is called self-altruism. I'm not going to test you on that term. And then some creatures like elephants, they help relatives or other elephants. That's called group altruism. That means I'm going to help my own species as a whole, because that helps me overall in ensuring the survival of my species. And then there's what's called interspecific competition. And here's a classic case. Dead zebra, lion, and vultures, and believe me, there's other birds that come down, secretary birds. There's hyenas that come out, and foxes and other creatures that are all after that dead animal. They're all in direct interspecific competition for that carcass. And the lion's not too happy because it's probably the one that killed it, and here's all these creatures trying to feed off at the same time. So this is kind of like bad dinner etiquette, and they have to find a way to get along. And usually what happens, the lion eats its share, leaves a lot behind, and the vultures and other animals get it. And again, a competitive situation. Guys, sometimes competition, whether it's intra or interspecific, can lead to something called competitive exclusion. That means if you're competing particularly for very limited habitat, you could displace somebody from that habitat, and that species has to move somewhere else, or individuals to move somewhere else, or die or not reproduce. And this is a big basis of extinction sometimes, when creatures are forced into smaller areas and their habitats overlap, or they're crunched in, or their habitat is, lost, and they have to compete for the same niche, overlapping niches. So sometimes what happens with competition is when creatures are competing for the same habitat, what happens is they learn to share as long as their niches are different. And what happens in young environments, new environments, what happens in growing biomes is these birds might have come from a common ancestry that all looked very similar, with a little genetic variation, obviously. That means some can look like this and have a little more orange like that one, and they could have had a little more blue in their wings like that one, if I'm getting the colors right. So what happens is in a population, instead of competing with itself, is There could be a selection of certain individuals have traits that allow them to live in different parts of the trees, or they can voluntarily do that, or eat different foods from the others. So this is an example of 5 what are called warblers that all came from a common ancestor, and after tens of thousands of years of coexisting, it broke up into 5 different subpopulations or species that each live in different parts of the tree or eat different foods, so they're not in direct competition with each other. And that's neat. And this is typically of what an ecosystem is made of. So now let us look at this concept of what we call symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. Symbiosis, it's really a general term, and sometimes it's mistaught to represent this thing. But symbiosis just means a long-lasting relationship where creatures are living together. And that means literally interacting with each other, not like avoiding each other like predator-prey. So this means they live together continuously in some type of relationship. And symbiosis comes in 3 forms. Parasitism, which is shown right here, which is beautiful little tapeworm, which lives up your butt, maybe not yours directly, but I know I've carried a few in my time. And you know, you find this also in sushi fish and stuff like that. I hate to tell you that. And there's other types of worms that live in us too, what we call parasitically. There's commensalism, which we're going to see a little later what that is, because that term comes from literally to feed together. Okay, and then there's mutualism, which is we're going to see a mutually beneficial way that organisms can live together. So when we look at these symbiotic relationships, parasitism is just like it's defined here. A creature lives off of you, sometimes on the surface or inside, like what's called an endoparasite or ectoparasite. They live off of your resources, and they actually compete with you for it. By they can suck your blood, they can eat your body fluids, they can live in your intestine and eat the food right before you get it. And again, we can go back to particularly tapeworms and other types of worms. I found when I was doing working as a research assistant after my bachelor's as a animal pathologist for the Neurozoological Society, I worked with researchers identifying the effects of pollution, water pollution, on fish parasites. And this was kind of interesting because we discovered that as water pollution went up, the number of parasites, particularly worms and fish, went down. And this was great for the fish and great for you if you eat fish, because if you did not know it, you can't get these parasites out of the fish. Usually when you cook fish, you cook the parasites and they kind of are gone, they won't hurt you. That's the problem with eating sushi, is that you're exposing yourself to living parasites in the flesh of the fish. And that's why with sushi fish, it has to be specially designated as it, because what they do is they'll freeze it at minus 90 Fahrenheit for a long time until the parasites are dead and disintegrated. But guys, this was neat that we discovered that. But the bad thing is that where did the fish get their parasites from? It was in their food, just like you do sometimes. So that meant that these fish were going to be on a population decline, because if they don't have enough parasite, a certain number of parasites, that means they're not eating. And that could be a problem. Or it could be what they're eating is low in parasites. We discovered that too. And those creatures will not get their food and cause this cascade effect of death and devastation. Usually parasites, again, don't cause disease. They can cause minor illness. The thing is they want to live in you for a long period of time, your whole life. And even in the case of fleas, pass on to your children. Then there's the commensalism term. And you saw that in the picture of the sharks with the little remora fish. Is these are two that kind of live together where one benefits and another does not. So when you see sharks swimming around, sharks have other fish called pilot fish, remoras, sometimes big fish, little fish hooking onto them or swimming around their face. And it's annoying, it doesn't benefit the shark or hurt the shark. But these little fish, when a shark eats, they're able to get the little morsels that a sloppy eating shark leaves behind. It doesn't hurt the shark, it doesn't take away from their food. It does keep the ocean clean, and it keeps those little commensals happy. And then there's something called mutualism, and I wish a book gave something a little more knowable than something called mycorrhizae. These are a special type of fungus that live in the roots of plants. And there's also something called rhizobium bacteria, which live in the roots of plants. And what both of those do is they help provide the plant with nutrients. In the case of mycorrhizae, water. They help the roots to survive by being better at taking up nutrients of water, which helps the plants, and the roots protect the mycorrhizae and the bacteria from being eaten, and it gives them a consistent protected environment. So that's mutualism. We're going to look at all this when we start looking at biomes and how do we conserve ecosystems and biomes. So I know there's a lot of terms here, but now we're looking at another way to look at interactions in an environment. So guys, when populations of a species live together in a particular ecosystem, they interact as something called a community. So a community is a collection, well, I have to say an assemblage, a collection of interacting different species, different populations in a confined area, or what we call a delineated area. It means something you can identify as having a border. An ecosystem itself is an environment that has some type of physical boundary, not a political boundary. That's set up by humans. It means like a pond has a physical boundary of where it starts. A certain type of forest does, a desert does. This all makes up an ecosystem. So what we learned within an ecosystem, the way communities interact with the different populations is each creature takes on different roles depending on their natural selection, outcomes. So some creatures are called producers, and this includes primarily plants and certain types of bacteria. Is that these are creatures, and algae I should say, these are creatures that take sunlight energy or energy from the earth. We're going to learn about these. They live around volcanic areas, particularly deep in the ocean. They use energy from the earth or from the sun to build the molecules they need. That means that they don't eat. They synthesize everything they need using energy from the outside. You can't do that. You need an incredible energy source to make your own food molecules. So that means they take elements out of the soil, out of water, and build them. We can do this in a lab. It's called synthetic chemistry. A lot of your drugs are made in a lab the same way these guys do in their bodies. We're basically modeling life. And you see this on shows like Star Trek and other science fictions where they synthesize their own food using machinery. Producers do that. But again, they need an energy source, and that's either the sun or internal forces from the earth. And then there's the consumers. This means I'm too lazy to make my food, or I don't have the chemistry or genetics to do it, so I'm going to eat them or other consumers. So they eat their organic matter. That means that they take the molecules of another creature, break down the molecules into simple units, not into elements, but simple units, and I rebuild it into me. So when you eat a plant, you're taking the plant structure, taking it apart, and trying to build you the best you can from the plant materials. Sort of like taking, let's say you made something out of Legos, and you take it apart and rebuild it into something else using the same Legos. Now, you might not be able to build all of what you need and borrow all the Legos, but that's why creatures eat a variety of foods usually. That's why you eat plants and animals. They all have different types of organic components. And then there's creatures, my favorite, the decomposers. They're patient. They wait for things to die, and then they eat the body they cause to rot. Things would not normally rot without decomposers. Now, sunlight and oxygen will break down the flesh, but not to the point where decomposers can get it. Because without decomposers, things would just mummify. And you just see these dried shrivels of things all over the place. And decomposers release the nutrients of creatures. It could break creatures right down into their basic elements. They also eat the poop and pee and other stuff we don't want to be associated with it. So they can turn anything into food. And they're the basis of how ecosystems survive. So what does it look like to be a consumer, producer, and whatever? And this is a typical thing called a trophic level pyramid. What's funny, when you see these for oceans, they tend to be upside down. But to explain this pyramid is, if you're on the top of the pyramid, it means you eat everything below it. Now, there's nothing below this pyramid because they're fueled by sunshine. And I'm going to make a little sun. There we go. That's a second grade or first grade sun. So there's a little sun, whatever. I'll even make him a happy face. He's a happy sun. So they get it from sunlight or from volcanic activity. We're not going to worry about that because most of the producers use sunlight. So what they do is they make food, and that food gets passed up to here, to the herbivores. These are creatures that eat plants. We sometimes call them primary consumers because that means they're the first consumer that eats the producers. Don't worry about that so much, but just know the terms. Whatever. So guys, notice as the pyramids go up, they get smaller. And that means that, guys, there has to be more producers out there to provide the food for a certain population of herbivores. So in an ecosystem, the largest population of creatures has to be the producers. And then the next largest, the herbivores. And then the next largest, what we call carnivores. That means creatures that eat other animals. Because herbivores obviously tend to be animals. Now, not necessarily true, but we're going to leave that alone. They're called secondary consumers because they don't eat the producer directly, they eat someone that eats a producer. So that means the producer's nutrients go from here to here. Isn't that nice? And if you're what's called a top carnivore, a tertiary consumer, that means that you eat flesh of creatures that eat flesh, and then they eat plants. So these are critical examples and typical examples of producers. Plants. And look at the mouse, he has a plant in his mouth. He's an herbivore. Then they do eat insects. I mean, that's true too. So they're kind of what we call sometimes omnivores. That means they eat both, but primarily they're herbivores. They eat grains. Well, look at a snake. He got little Mickey in his mouth. Okay, he's a secondary consumer or first carnivore. And then him himself, he actually gets hunted by hawks. That's not a hawk carrying a rope. That's carrying him, who ate him, and who ate that. So eventually the hawk did get the grass, but it was indirect. He actually got the nutrient from the grass. So guys, hawks have low populations because their food has a medium to low population, and the snake has a certain population based on the mouse. The mouse's population is based on the grass. So when you start talking about affecting biomes as humans, we can wreak havoc by killing off or lowering the amount of producers, because that in turn shortens this period to the point where there are no hawks left, or that there are so few hawks they don't have the option of mating and building up a population. This we see happening all throughout every continent. Creatures are slowly getting such low populations they're dying off, and the only ones that are existing are in zoos. Now here's a nice part. Who feeds off of the rest of this pyramid is the decomposers. That means when they die or poop, their stuff goes here, and the decomposers provide now basic nutrients, not food, but elements, for the producers to build into the molecules of life. This is a beautiful picture of what goes on in nature. But understand that scientists use these. We can add numbers. That means the mass of an animal, number of animals or plants in these pyramids to keep track of the health of an environment. Now, besides food flowing through an environment, so does energy. And we're going to learn, guys, when you eat not just for food, for raw materials, you also eat food for this thing called the K, or a calorie. Okay, don't worry about that. I haven't got my touchpad yet, it's coming. Okay, calorie. So that's terrible, but that's an R. Okay, so you have this thing called a calorie, and that's an O. Okay, and that's an I. So the calorie, that was terrible. What happens is when you have a certain amount of calories of plants or producers, which could be bacteria, that's the energy that they carry in their flesh to keep themselves alive. Now, if they're eaten, their calories of flesh get sent to them. And if they get eaten, their calories of flesh get sent to them. Guys, when you buy food and it says calories in it, that means the amount of energy in that food has in it for you to stay alive. And there's a little secondary carnivores. Guys, what happens is this in an environment is as a creature gets eaten, not all of the calories of its body goes into the next creature that eats it. On average, guys, you lose 90% of the calories that you eat from a food. Now, we do it less because we don't run around chasing our food. But that means that if a food has like 1,000 calories in it, you only get 100 on the most part. Now again, humans are kind of like a little perverted and twisted as far as creatures go, but a typical animal like a wolf, because it has to spend energy to catch its prey, there are days it doesn't eat, whatever, so it has to make a meal last a long time. But the thing is that the process of chewing and whatever and living burns up calories. So that means you have to have, if you have, let's say 1,000 calories, 1K, 1,000 calories, because they're also called kilocalories, don't worry about that, that's why I put K, of plants, it can support 100 calories of animal, which means a certain amount of weight or livelihood of animal like an herbivore. And that means only 10 of those calories are available here and 1 calorie here. So they have to spend more time finding food to stay alive. And if you lower this, there might not be enough energy from the constant passing down to keep them alive. So eating passes 2 things through an ecosystem: nutrients and calories. And they pass through something called the food chain or food web. Nature does not exist as a food chain. That matters me because when we use a food chain all the time, but it's just looking at one type of interaction of what we call a food web. So food web just means within an ecosystem, I identified all the players in a certain little area that eat each other or are fed on by another. All these interactions. In all environments, you find unique food webs, and sometimes food webs of different creatures interact. So this is the food web of, let's say, a deer. Okay, and that deer feeds off of plants, which also interacts with other things that compete with the deer for food, or else help the plant or hinder the plant's survival. The deer is also preyed upon by other animals too, okay, which happen not to be here. So the competitors for the deer might have predators that eat away the competition or allow too much of the competition for the deer to be behind. Now, if this had a wolf, that wolf can now be a predator to the deer and also to the rabbit and even the fox at times. So these are very complex things. But the way scientists look at food webs is, unfortunately, we have to look at one animal at a time in a chain. And one animal could have 4 chains. So, for example, we have here the food chain for, let's say, a particular frog. It feeds, let's say, on this particular spider when it's there, and that spider eats on a grasshopper, that grasshopper eats a pondweed, and that frog is eaten by a certain type of predatory fish, and the fish is eaten by a person, or let's say a bear, okay, or some type of other animal. Is that this is one thing that frog could be doing. It could exist, it can have several food chains, meaning I can eat a beetle, I could eat this or that, but this is where generally it can fit into a food web. So when we look at all these interactions of predator-prey and interspecific competition, we pay attention to where things fit into an ecosystem as far as they interact, particularly in this distribution of nutrients and energy. Because if one of these players disappears, it could either have a major impact or minor impact on the nutrient or energy flow. That means if this frog only eats that spider and that is it, and that spider's gone, that could affect everything here and also affect everything below, depending on what their food tolerances are. So, what does it mean to pass nutrients through a population? We have this idea called biogeochemical cycling. It just means that, guys, the way we can trace food is look at how the elements in a food pass from creature to creature. Because usually with carnivores and herbivores, they're not passing elements between each other, but actually molecules like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and sugars. But in general, plants are getting elements from nature and building it into molecules. So we have these different cycles called carbon cycle, phosphorus cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, and oxygen cycle. This one we're not going to cover too much because that actually works together with the water cycle. It's a unique cycle in itself. We also have something called the sulfur cycle, which is not covered in this overhead, but it is important and it's in your book. Okay, so what happens when a predator eats a prey, or an herbivore eats a plant, it is making use of the carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, water, and even oxygen in that creature. The carbon cycle, what's important about it is that the carbon is an element that builds your raw material and provides you with energy. This is a fundamental molecule that makes an organism a living organism. So without carbon, there wouldn't be life on Earth. Well, at least it would be in a different form we don't even recognize, because we know that that's possible now to have life without carbon. But we live in what's called a carbon-based life. So that means we need a certain amount of carbon in this world, most of which, believe it or not, is buried in petrol and coal reserves and deep in the earth. But we have a certain amount of carbon, and the way we measure carbon is something called biomass. We can actually weigh the animal, say how much carbon is that animal that gives its flesh, and how much of the mass of that flesh is available to, let's say, that cougar, and how much of the flesh of a plant is needed for that deer. So when we talk about carbon cycle, you hear a term called biomass, in which we literally weigh and calculate the amount of carbon that is taken in by that animal and is also given off through waste products and through its body being eaten or dying. Carbon gets cycled, from the atmosphere through CO2 and is taken in by plants to literally build sugars and other nutrients. But understand, guys, the carbon cycle is directly associated with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which also comes from pollutants and burning things. So all of us produce CO2. All living things do. But so do other processes that compete for that amount of space that carbon dioxide takes in the universe. So that's the carbon cycle. When we start getting into global climate change and the use of fossil fuels are part of the carbon cycle. And they contribute to it sometimes in very good ways, sometimes in very bad ways. Nitrogen cycle. This is critical. This is a cycle that is traced through the through the molecule called a protein. So when we talk about nitrogen cycle, this is where organisms eat protein to stay alive. To stay alive. Okay, so, and that was spelled wrong. But anyway, so we have bacteria that live in the soil, which is why soil is important, that recycle protein through nitrogen in the atmosphere, put it into the soil as elements, and plants take it up, and then when plants are eaten, their nitrogen or proteins go to herbivores, which eventually end up in carnivores, and carnivores poop, pee, and die, and their nitrogen gets cycled. Some of it stays in the soil, some of it goes to the atmosphere and is brought back. Don't worry about memorizing this cycle, but do know that this is where soil is very involved in two very important bacteria called nitrifying and denitrifying soil. And believe me, farmers know about this. They pay attention to this. So the nitrogen cycle is involved in proteins. And guys, nitrogen cycle determines the nutritious capacity of food, how much protein is present in a food. And if you have food that is low in nitrogen cycle components, and I want you to look this up as a homework assignment, look up a disease called NOMA. It's found in animals, but it's more prevalent in humans, and it's more obvious in humans. It's called NOMA, NOMA disease. NOMA is due to people living in an area where their food is not subjected to a healthy nitrogen cycle, and their food ends up low in protein, and this means people also have access only to plants and very little animals, which are high in nitrogen. Look at what happens to them, and I want you to think about trying to explain it. And if you have questions about it, ask me. But this is what happens when people living in poverty don't have access to a very healthy nitrogen cycle. And mostly in the United States and Europe and in urban areas, we don't have to worry about this. Phosphorus cycle. Sometimes I call this the poop cycle. We'll learn a little more about this. This involves rock and involves an element called phosphorus. Phosphorus in your body is involved in energy transfer and the functioning of your DNA. So without phosphorus, we can't produce the energy we need to live and reproduce or have the materials we need to survive and carry out our daily processes. So whatever. So phosphorus cycle very much moves from soil to plants to organisms, and not to the air, but to actually soil, and cycles back again. It's very important, just as important as the nitrogen cycle, say, but it's very important in determining how much life could exist on Earth. So carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, without these three being able to cycle, we can have major problems. And one major problem is how humans handle our own dead bodies and sewage. We don't allow our bodies to become part of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. We don't allow ourselves to decay. We also put our poop into areas of the earth, that means deep in the ocean, dispose of it, or into landfills where it never gets to see another organism. And this means whatever we're taking in as a huge population of people, that nitrogen, phosphorus, and even sulfur is not getting back into the environment. And slowly we are depleting the environment of nitrogen and phosphorus. We're competing for other organisms right now for this, and even countries competing for it. This is a major, major problem. The way we live today is not sustainable. And as a population goes to 2050, we're going to find that we might not even make it there as an intact population, because we're going to be all competing for ways of getting nitrogen and phosphorus into our diets. So, to summarize this, guys, this is a complex set of concepts I gave you. But do appreciate, what this all means, and that through this system, guys, the Earth needs some type of outside energy. Sunlight, or again, volcanic activity of some type, usually deep in the ocean. So the sun gives the Earth this energy. Producers use that energy to collect energy themselves and to pass along energy and raw materials they build into a food for everybody in the ecosystem. Decomposers usually recycle the nutrients so they can be rebuilt again into food in the bodies of organisms. Now, what's really neat about this is as we do this, all of us produce heat. And we lose efficiency of the sun's energy and heat. It's all part of the eating efficiency that controls the population of every creature within an ecosystem. So to finish all of this off, and I know this is long and tedious, we're about halfway through. How are ecosystems and biomes born? And also, how do they heal when injury occurs? Because injury can occur to a biosystem. A tree dies, you build a house, you do something to it, or a whole ecosystem disappears because of a flood or a volcano or some type of natural disaster. So there's a process called succession. And succession is how ecosystems and communities heal or rebuild or grow from nothing. That means from bare rock. When an ecosystem matures, it's called a climax community. And climax communities can live anywhere from hundreds of years to millions of years. They're temporary, but it just means within a human lifespan, this is what we see every day when we walk out and look at these. So read about climax communities. I just gave you the definition of it, on what it means, and this is just another slide for it. But now what's important is looking at succession types. Guys, when you have bare land that's been scraped to the point where there's no real soil, just rock or waste or whatever left behind, a feature called primary succession kicks in. That means certain organisms, environmental factors, that means weather, can break down rock into soil and raw materials and provide a place for life to settle. If we ever do terraforming on other planets, it means growing food on other planets, we're going to be taking full advantage of primary succession because we know how to control it. We just got to make sure all the factors are there, and we can literally start life on another planet or grow the life from here on another planet. Secondary succession is more of a healing process. What if I damage an environment? Will it grow back? How fast? And what will it grow up into? Your book says it usually grows up into the climax community, but it's not necessarily so. It depends on the degree of disturbance. Like after a major, major wildfire, we can see a forest never recovers. After a volcano, I've seen this in Hawaii, just scorches an whole area, we can see another area comes back and not the original ecosystem. So here's what primary succession looks like. This is a rock, and these are very important things. You'll see this on a test called lichens. They help to break down the rock. They live off of a weird relationship between an algae, and that's actually lichen too. That's lichen and that lichen. The rock is literally covered with this stuff to the point where you can't even see the color of the rock. They tend to break down the rock. They use no other resources except algae and the fungi, and they literally eat raw materials off the rock by breaking it down, so they're digesting the rock and using solar energy to make food for themselves. Beautiful. You'll see this on our campus, on stones. You see it on the trails. These are found on the barks of trees sometimes, where they literally eat up the barks of trees very slowly, because these things can live for tens of thousands of years, and it can take them, a little spot like that can take 100 years to grow, and that spot's probably about the size of a quarter. So what they do, they're the soil producers, and they go through a series of steps in which lichens are replaced by other creatures, usually plants, that grow and die in a series of steps in which one thing replaces another to produce the mature community. Okay, so look at this diagram, be able to understand it. That we're looking at here is not one forest, but a succession of ages of forest. So, guys, primary succession can take hundreds of thousands of years of rocks breaking down and then small plants filling in, medium plants, larger plants, and what they do is they change the environment. These guys that come in, their seeds come in and overtake the next group of plants, and these guys just literally die every year. They don't care. They live in disturbed areas. So this is typical. It's called primary succession. And if we're able to get on campus, we can actually see this going on our own campus, on our nature trail. Primary succession, your book says, also occurs after flooding. I don't necessarily agree that this is primary succession, because there is soil here already, but a new type of soil forms. So sometimes what happens with ponds and rivers and lakes is they dry up, and they become overtaken by plants that eventually suck all the water out and eventually leave room for trees. And you could walk into a wooded area not knowing at one time it was a lake or a pond. And this is typical of Kingwood. Kingwood was a swampy prairie area that is now forest when it wasn't before. And it's because a new type of primary succession took over. That instead of the pond coming back or staying, it grew into a bunch of trees. Now, secondary succession, again, occurs in an area that is disturbed. So something affects the soil, kills all the trees, wipes out the area. It could be due to long-term climate change. And what it does, for example, is with secondary succession, it tries to replace the original forest, but not intentionally, of course. So in this example, a farmer plows a field. Let's say the farmer goes broke and abandons a field. This happens all the time in the Midwest and in the plain states. Little plants grow in. There's no lichens needed because there's soil there. Lichens don't grow on soil, only rock. So you have these yearly plants coming in, smaller plants, forest. And this is much quicker than primary succession. Look at that, 50 to 75 years. Actually, this could be longer because there's soil there. Soil takes a long time to form. And guys, and for soil and succession to form, you have to have very strict requirements in the environment, because that can determine the amount of years it takes healing to occur. And guys, if you whack out a tree here, secondary succession will occur where that tree left a gap in the forest. You'll see plants, little plants fill in and whatever, all to the point where another tree fills in that hole, either the same tree or another what we call climax tree. So, now we're on the term biome, and you're all at the point of probably, poking your eyes out right now. So a biome is a collection of ecosystems that are determined by the major plants that live there. And we're going to see we can make a biome map that has distinct biomes living in particular climate regions. And we can see here, look at this biome here, that's called a taiga, which is a Russian word, or what's called a coniferous or evergreen forest. They live here, and we also see they live in mountains of other areas too. So this is made up of a particular group of plants that fit and live in certain environmental parameters. And you can see one biome is distinct from another by those plants. And what these plants do is they determine the biomass or the amount of energy and nutrients in that area for very unique animals that coexist with those plants. So again, biomes are what we call terrestrial climax communities that are global and large and involve very unique and characteristic ecosystems and plants. And the two major factors that produce a biome, besides having soil present, is temperature, and we're going to see this is more specific, and patterns of precipitation. So biomes are where they are, not really by location, but because certain parts of the earth have higher temperatures than the other, and certain parts of the earth have more rainfall or snowfall than the others. So if climate changes, guys, significantly, we're already starting to see this in Alaska and in agriculture, we're seeing this, is that you could shift biomes around and destroy biomes, and we can lose them, and we can move a biome that used to be tropical up into a temperate area, and we can actually lose some of our colder biomes totally, because there's literally no place for them to live, these trees at least. So this is called the Whitaker chart. I actually had him as a professor for a class, and he told us this. And he just said, basically in this graph, you can predict where a biome is going to be and the characteristics of that biome based on whether the environment tends to be generally cold or generally warm or generally dry or generally wet. And if an area is actually generally warm and generally dry, we call it a desert. If it's generally cold or generally dry, it's also a desert. Isn't that funny? So we have hot deserts and cold deserts. Most people are not familiar with cold deserts, but the deserts in Arizona can get pretty damn cold, and in Mongolia we have damn cold deserts that barely get above freezing. And then if you never get above freezing, you have what's called a tundra, or I should say you barely do, because some tundras can get pretty damn hot in northern Alaska. And then if you're wet and warm, you have what's called a tropical rainforest, which is very typical of equatorial Africa, Asia, and South Central America. So a biome is a categorization of how we break down the world into separate little growing entities. Now something else, guys, that's important, and I'm going to just go to this slide, is altitude, the height that you are located in the earth also affects a biome. So as you go up in altitude, biomes, the atmosphere tends to get cooler, and that tends to change the nature of biomes. So for example, in Hawaii, we just drove through the island of Hawaii from coast to coast, okay, literally from Hilo to Kona, and we went over this huge mountain range. It gets about 8,000 feet, and within a day, literally half a day, few-hour drive, we went from tropical rainforest at the low altitude to a grassland, that means almost like a prairie at the middle altitude, and then to tundra. We actually saw tundra plants and snow that's almost there year-round in the mountain piece of Hawaii, and then back down as we were heading from Hilo to Kona, back down into a tropical dry, and then a tropical wet forest. Amazing, the different diversity we saw within a day of driving. And we couldn't believe it, but that's very typical of what happens when you go up in altitude. It acts the same as going up in latitude. We get colder and colder. So guys, as biomes go this way, they get colder. As they go up, they get colder. Now the problem is as you go this way, and sometimes within a latitude, you can find areas of wet and dry. Usually you get more wet on this side, more dry on this side, based on winds. Also in a mountain, if a mountain range is facing west, you're facing west, you tend to have wetter air than on this side, and there tends to be more rain here and sometimes almost no rain on this side due to the way clouds traverse the mountains. They basically climb up a mountain, lose all their water, they get so cold, they dry out and come back here. Sometimes the clouds disappear. So be aware of this, how biomes interact, because you can have different biomes within another biome. Now guys, humans have had an influence on biomes too, and we have taken away many of the aspects of the natural biomes and produced these things called anthropogenic biomes. And I know this chart is small, but it's looking at the negative human impacts of what we've done to the earth. So guys, we have produced our own biomes based on what we've done to soil and the local climate, basically, and to the way we disturb an environment. So we have areas called wildlands. And guys, these are areas that we manicure, but we generally leave alone. They tend to be wilderness, but it's wilderness that we drill in and do other stuff in, and we hunt in and we kill the animals either off completely or to the point where it's not a natural dynamics. So these are areas that we interfere with, but we generally don't eradicate them. It's not true wilderness. So if you go to the Yosemite, you are not seeing a natural thing. You're seeing a human disturbance environment that is affected by humans. It's actually a unique type of biome in itself. Then there's forest land. Forest land means we plant trees there intentionally to grow trees, and it looks pretty, and it lets you camp there and hunt there and fish there and even live in there sometimes if you want to deal with all the logging. Huntsville area is an example of this, Sam Houston Park. It's a tree farm, basically. It was originally designed by the National Park Service to have enough trees to run the railroads. Isn't that funny? To have enough for building trains, building the railroad ties, and burning. Then there's rangeland. You see it a lot around here. This is where we allow cattle to range. Actually, it started originally for sheep, funny enough, in this country. So sheep, cattle, and goats, depending on your country, and even chickens, if you have free-range chickens, this land was put aside just for that. And it causes major disturbance to the environment and makes its own biome that's maintained by the cattle and the goats. The Sahara, the belief about the Sahara Desert at one time was it was a natural rangeland and actually tropical forest that humans put so much grazing on, it ate the place away to nothing till all the vegetation died. And today this is a vast wasteland. It's not even a biome, really. That is what gives us enough heat off of that to go over the ocean and produce a heavy hurricane season in this area that sometimes creeps up to us. And then there's croplands, different variations in which we replace the natural habitat, the ecosystem itself, and sometimes almost the whole biome with our own artificial plants. And this is maintained by humans. Usually crops are planted dependent on their environmental factors that they survive best under. And then we get into what are called the human dense environments. That means villages, small cities, somewhat rural to suburban, and then major urban areas. These are probably the worst on the environment because they're really at the point of almost no vegetation. They can't produce their own natural resources, their own food. There's no cycling going on whatsoever. There's more of what we call cycling export. That means whatever waste we produce goes somewhere else and never makes it back into the environment. This can actually change the climate. It's been known to. Cities change the local climate to the point where the original biome on the outskirts, that means in these areas, the villages and even wild biomes nearby cannot survive. And you see this in the Houston area, you see it in many other countries. So just be aware of the anthropogenic biomes. This is not really mentioned in your book, but it is important. Now the last of the biomes, and I want you to be familiar at least with the terrestrial biomes, the different types. So please know that for the test. Read it in your book. There are also what are called aquatic ecosystems or biomes. There's a big debate on whether it's a biome or not, because biomes are defined by trees technically. But that's only because the people that study them actually in Germany were interested more in trees and lumbering. Now we believe that these ecosystems we call aquatic, that means water, are equivalent to biomes in themselves. And we're going to see that they're mostly classified based on the amount of salt. That means the salt for the most part, is dissolved in that water. So we can see that there are what are called freshwater ecosystems, transitional, that means they're not quite fresh, but also not quite salty like this one's, like the marine. So these are very salty, anywhere from 2.5% salt to 4%, which are sometimes called hypersaline. These tend to vary in their salt content back and forth. This is usually where rivers, freshwater bodies, meet the ocean. And these are some of the most beautiful, diverse, rich places. My favorite one was almost washed away in St. Croix, where I stayed along this beautiful tropical estuary that had the most abundant life form I've seen in my whole life, living in this area where freshwater and saltwater mixed and changed back and forth. And then, of course, we have our freshwater, like lakes and ponds and streams. Now, when we look at the salty ecosystems, this water has to be salty for the creatures to survive. This salt is 2.5 times more powerful than your body can tolerate. And you will dehydrate and also have too much sodium uptake and other mineral uptake to the point where you will die a miserable, hallucinatory death. Certain creatures can survive in it. They have ways of adapting. We're not going to cover that in this class, but they need it. And this is a problem when marine ecosystems come in contact with rain. It can dilute them to the point where these creatures do not survive. So what we can do when we look at marine ecosystems, we're going to see there's two worlds to the aquatic environment. World one is called the benthic world. That means creatures that live attached to the soil, or the bottom, or the rocks, or the ledges. That means the beachfront. So if your feet hit the bottom of a marine ecosystem or hit land, you are benthic. Now the abyssal ecosystem means basically an incredibly great depth. And this is unique, okay, to the benthic regions. So we have this thing called the benthic, but sometimes the benthic gets so deep, you end up with these incredible conditions that cannot support photosynthesis. It has very unique food chains that are mainly based on death and destruction from the benthic region. So when you have these things called abyssal ecosystems, they're almost a biome in their own. This tends to be very weird deep-sea creatures you sometimes would see on SpongeBob when he takes the chip off of Bikini Bottom. So when we look at the benthic region, this is a diagram of it I'd like you to be familiar with. This would be your abyssal benthic, and this would be your just standard benthic. And we can see the benthic can be here, it can be here, it can be here, and there. And this is actually not too unlike what we see off of Galveston, except this is not as steep. It's a little more gradual. When I was in Samoa, we actually had a benthic region that was that steep. So this is typical of marine environment. Now, when we look at the benthic area, what determines the nature of the benthic area besides depth is also, the amount of sunlight that penetrates into the water and also the type of substrate. So we can see that in oceans, seas, is usually we can either have mud, okay, don't worry about the little oxygen content, but also rocky surfaces. And this makes a big difference in what grows. Like, for example, corals. Some corals love a benthic region of mud. Some corals like rocky ones, and they don't mix. Some plants love muddy ones. Certain animals like sticking to the surface of rocks. So when we look at a marine ecosystem, we're looking at plants too and animals that require certain types of bottom surfaces. Now, this is looking at more of a shoreline. It's just a nice pretty picture to look at, but sometimes in benthic areas, you have areas called tidal zones, tidal, T-I-D-A-L, in which the water is temporary. And you get sometimes these 6-hour changes of water, either making the area submerged or dry. And sometimes we call these intertidal regions too. So you can have life that exists totally submerged along an area or partially dry. And you see this in Galveston all the time when the tide goes up and down. When the tide goes down, you see it too far, sometimes you see these creatures can't survive and they get stuck. But mostly what you see is something like this, a little sand and maybe some crabs and other animals hanging out there. And then there's an area above the tide, which is really not part of the benthic anymore. It's part of the actual beach, the terrestrial biome. And this area should not be submerged or even wet because those plants can take it. So the benthic area is pretty extensive, and it's pretty packed with a diversity of life. Now, also in marine ecosystems, we have the open areas too, okay, besides the benthos. And the open areas are what allow exposure to sunlight. When we look at different types of marine ecosystems, coral reefs are a very unique one because they like living, again, in very unique benthic areas, and particularly coral reefs. They like very muddy areas that have shallow open water areas and get a lot of sunlight. Okay, the richness of a coral reef, like we see here, very specific, and they live in very specific temperature ocean ranges. I mean, it's very warm water, funny enough, very much like plants in a biome. So when we think about ocean areas, think about, again, the type of soil that's there, which we call the benthos, the water above it, which when you read your book, you'll learn about the terms the pelagic area, the open area, and think about the temperature of water being all factors that determine the health. And right now, our coral reefs off the Gulf of Mexico, we have one only not too far off the Gulf, coast of Texas, it is dependent on very salty fresh water, warm water, which is now being interfered with by all the rainfall we get. We've been seeing a lot of unusual rainfall. And what happens is that fresh water comes in here, it's cold, and it literally kills off the coral and changes that whole coral reef ecosystem. Marine ecosystems can also be associated with what's called an estuary. And an estuary is where basically a freshwater body mixes with seawater. And I've mentioned this before. New Orleans is a giant estuary. Rio Grande, Rio Bravo has a giant estuary in Brownsville and Matamoros across the border. Houston, of course, the ship channel area leads into a huge estuary. So that means that this water does have a little tide, but the tide doesn't really go up and down as much as it changes from fresh water to salt water. And these are very unique environments, have very unique creatures. We see a lot of oysters living here, a lot of seafood that you eat. But these are also very fragile environments too. But they still come under the category of marine because they do have a saltiness content that is still beyond what we call fresh water. And then there's unique areas. You find this in Key West. Usually you don't find much of this in the United States. You see a lot of these in Puerto Rico or what are called mangrove swamps. And these are just saltwater swampy areas with plants that can tolerate the marine wetness. Okay, now freshwater ecosystems. So take an ocean, make it smaller and shallower, take out all the salt, and add to it sometimes a body of water either flowing in and out of it. You have a freshwater ecosystem. Freshwater ecosystems, the salt content it's low, almost equivalent to your blood, which means you could drink it and it won't dehydrate you, it won't harm you in any way unless there's something bad in there. So this type of ecosystem is probably how the whole world started. The ancient ocean started out this way, and freshwater ecosystems are remnants of pits and mountain flows and whatever that come from rain and from glaciers, especially the Great Lakes. Those are all glacial water at one time. Okay, the oceans themselves became saltier over time and separate from these freshwater ecosystems. So what we find is we have these stationary systems that are make up what are called lakes, ponds, and reservoirs, and some people call these lentic, that's the technical term. And then we have running bodies of fresh water called lardic, which means fast-moving bodies of water. So fresh water is usually classified into moving water and running water, two totally different ecosystems, totally different adaptations, different creatures. And stationary supplies can come from rainfall, they can come from lakes, but usually what they do is they lead to larger bodies of water that are usually lakes or marine ecosystems. Okay, so guys, understand that just like an ocean, standing bodies of waters, that means lentic systems like lakes and ponds, they also have structure to them. Okay, very much like an ocean. But instead of having, benthic, they use different names for how we discuss the layers of them. So this is showing a pond, and the pond does use the term benthic, but it's usually the deeper bottom, which in an ocean would be the abyssal benthic. It has an area called the littoral zone, which is in an ocean the shallow benthic. We call it littoral, it just means because it borderlines another very unique forested ecosystem usually. It's totally different than what you find in oceans and marine areas. The open area is called limnetic zone. Limnos means lake. In ocean it's called pelagic. Okay, and then we have this area here, you can see the shallow area where sunlight penetrates called the euphotic zone. That means good sunlight. So basically it's the same thing. You have a shallow area and a slope. We just use different terminology because unfortunately people that study lakes, they're called limnologists. We're different than people that study the ocean called oceanologists. And limnologists were usually people in inland areas that had their own science, their own terminology, versus ocean people tend to use terminology based on more Russian and Greek terms. I think that's kind of cool. But just know the structure. Know the names. Now, when we look at rivers and streams, we usually call these riparian areas. Riparis just means a stream. Isn't that nice to know? These include a moving body of water called the stream bed or the stream. Whether it's a river or a stream, it's still the stream bed or riverbed. We have these areas of soil which are rich in plants. They're also so wet that they only allow certain types of plants to live. And then you have the drier areas of soil where trees live. These trees like the drier soil, and that's why they're actually what we call oaks. A lot of oaks live up there, and a lot of maples and willows would live down here, particularly in our region. This is called the bedrock. It's just the soil, the rocks underneath that produce the soil up here. We'll learn that later. And then we have what's called the floodplain, which is not listed on here. The floodplain. That means this area, when the river is high, tends to fill in that area temporarily. Now, it's not supposed to remain full because it will kill all of this stuff, sometimes within a few days. The Harvey flooding devastated a lot of these floodplain area trees and killed them off because the floods lasted so long. So this is the structure of aquatic ecosystems. And I know this was a long lecture, but you're going to have a couple of videos to look at and some habitable planets to look at that reinforce all of this. Again, as usual, if you have any questions, please ask me. And we got Mr. Bean here again. Please email me or voicemail me. Emails preferred if you have any questions. Thank you.